Medieval warfare was far more brutal and advanced than most people imagine. New weapons kept appearing, and each one forced armies to change how they fought on the battlefield. Some could stop armored knights, others could destroy formations or even break castle defenses. Here are 6 medieval weapons so brutal and powerful that they changed warfare forever. Number 1. The lance. In medieval Europe, the lance was much more than a long spear on horseback. It was the weapon that helped turn the knight into the central figure of war for centuries. Earlier horsemen had used spears in many ways, but the real shift came when riders began using the couched lance, locking it under the arm and driving it forward with the full weight of the horse behind it. That sounds simple, but it changed everything. Now the impact did not come only from a man's arm. It came from speed, mass, training, and discipline working together. A mailed or armored knight on a strong warhorse could hit like a moving wall. And against loose infantry or poorly prepared troops, that kind of charge could tear a line open in seconds. This style of fighting also depended on a whole support system. Good saddles, stirrups, trained horses, squires, spare mounts, and enough money to keep expensive equipment in service. So when people picture medieval warfare as being dominated by knights, the lance is a big reason why. It was the weapon that turned social status into battlefield shock. The lance also changed the social side of war. To fight this way, a man needed land, money, armor, horses, servants, and years of training. That is one reason knightly warfare became tied to the feudal system. Medieval armies were not just groups of men with weapons. They were built around expensive mounted elites who expected to dominate the battlefield. The life of a knight, from training as a page and squire to learning mounted combat, was shaped by this weapon. Tournaments, cavalry tactics, heraldry, and the whole image of noble warfare grew around the lance. At the same time, it forced everyone else to adapt. Infantry had to learn to stand firm, use rough ground, dig in, or form dense spear walls. Commanders had to think about terrain in a new way, because open ground could favor a cavalry charge, while mud, slopes, ditches, or woods could ruin it. So the lance did not just make cavalry stronger. It forced the rest of medieval warfare to organize itself around the problem of stopping cavalry shock. Once that became the standard, armies needed ways to hit back before the knights ever reached them. And that is where the next weapon changed the balance. Number 2. The longbow. The longbow became famous because it gave medieval armies something that could break the rhythm of a knightly attack before swords ever crossed. In English hands, drawing on Welsh practice and experience, the longbow turned trained foot soldiers into a battlefield force that noble cavalry could not ignore. A war longbow was not a light hunting bow. It was a tall, powerful weapon, often made from yew, and it demanded serious strength to use well. That is the key point people sometimes miss. You could not hand one to an untrained recruit and expect miracles. Skilled longbowmen were built by years of practice, and in medieval England that meant laws, regular archery training, stockpiles of arrows, and a system that treated the bow as a national military tool, not just a personal weapon. Its battlefield effect came from speed and pressure. A good archer could lose several arrows in the time it took many mechanical weapons to fire once, and that constant rain of shafts could break timing, wound horses, hit men with lighter protection, and exploit weak points in armor or exposed faces and limbs. It is true that modern people sometimes exaggerate the longbow, as if every arrow sliced through the best plate armor with ease. That was not the reality.
High-quality plate could resist a lot, especially at longer range. But warfare is not only about perfect penetration, it is about disorder. At battles like Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt,
English archers helped create confusion, slowed advances, shattered formation, and made attacks collapse under pressure. Even when arrows did not kill outright, they could ruin momentum, panic horses, and turn an organized advance into a crowded disaster. The longbow also changed how armies were built. It encouraged commanders to combine archers with men-at-arms on foot, to choose strong defensive ground, to use stakes and prepared positions, and to let the enemy walk into a zone of repeated missile pressure. That was a major shift away from the older idea that battle would be decided mainly by elite mounted fighters. Still, the longbow had one hard limit. It needed years of practice, and a society prepared to invest in that training. Most rulers wanted something dangerous that could be learned faster, and that opened the way for the crossbow. Number 3. The crossbow. If the longbow represented disciplined national training, the crossbow represented a different kind of revolution. It let medieval soldiers store power mechanically, hold that power ready, and release it with much less physical strain at the moment of firing. That mattered a lot in real warfare. A crossbowman did not need the same lifetime of conditioning as a longbowman. He still needed skill, nerve, and practice, especially in loading under pressure, but the barrier to becoming effective was lower. That made the crossbow extremely useful for cities, mercenary companies, castle garrisons, and rulers who needed reliable missile troops without waiting a generation to produce them. For many rulers, that meant military power could be bought, hired, and organized faster than before. The weapon itself kept improving.
Early forms were dangerous enough, but later versions with composite or steel prods, along with spanning tools like belt hooks, goat's foot levers, and windlasses, could deliver serious force. At short range, crossbow bolts were a real threat to mail, lighter armor, and any exposed part of the body, and even heavily armored men had to respect them. That is one reason the crossbow became so feared in medieval Europe. Church authorities even tried to limit its use against fellow Christians, which tells you how shocking its reputation had become, though armies kept using it anyway, because it worked. The crossbow was especially strong in siege warfare. Defenders on walls could aim carefully from cover, and attackers could use large pavises, those tall shields planted in the ground, to reload behind protection. It also worked well in cramped places where a full-size war bow was harder to manage, including city fighting, castle approaches, and shipboard combat in the Mediterranean. In open battle, famous mercenary units like the Genoese crossbowmen showed how important trained missile specialists had become. The crossbow also changed armored combat indirectly. Once a weapon could put dangerous force into the hands of a broader group of soldiers, armor had to improve, shields had to adapt, and commanders had to rethink exposure on the battlefield. Men could no longer assume that skill at close combat alone would protect them. A well-placed bolt from a relatively ordinary soldier could end a nobleman's fight in a second. That was a deep change in medieval warfare. But ranged weapons still were not enough by themselves. To truly stop cavalry and take control of the field, armies needed infantry formations that could stand their ground and push back physically, and that is where the pike changed war again. Number 4. The pike. The pike looked simple, almost plain compared with decorated swords or heavy cavalry armor, but its impact on medieval warfare was enormous. This was not a normal spear. It was a very long thrusting weapon, often well over 12 feet and sometimes much longer, designed to create a wall of points that horses and riders could not easily break. What changed warfare was not just the weapon by itself, it was the formation built around it.
When medieval soldiers held pikes in disciplined ranks shoulder to shoulder, they stopped fighting as scattered individuals and started fighting as a machine. That was bad news for knights. A cavalry charge depended on fear, speed, and disruption. If infantry panicked, the charge worked. If infantry held a solid forest of pike heads, the charge could collapse into confusion, dead horses, and trapped riders. Medieval Europe saw this lesson again and again. The Flemish militias at Courtrai, the Swiss in battle after battle, and other disciplined infantry forces proved that heavily armored nobles were not unbeatable just because they were mounted and well-born. This mattered beyond tactics. It changed who could matter in war. Town militias, peasant infantry under strong leadership, and professional mercenary blocks could all become central players if they had training and cohesion. The pike also demanded a new military culture. Men had to drill, keep formation, trust one another, and move as a body. That is very different from the older, heroic image of single combat and personal glory. In a pike block, your survival depended on the line holding together. If one part broke, the whole formation was in danger. These formations were often supported by shorter polearms, swords, or halberds for the close crush once the lines met. But the pike gave the structure. In Swiss hands especially, pike formations were not only defensive. They could advance aggressively, absorb pressure, and then drive straight into enemy lines with shocking force. That helped prove that disciplined infantry could seize initiative instead of simply waiting to survive a charge.
It let infantry hold open ground, resist cavalry, and even advance against enemies who would once have expected foot soldiers to scatter. In that sense, the pike was one of the clearest signs that medieval warfare was moving toward disciplined mass infantry. And once infantry could control the open field, the next question was, what happened when an enemy withdrew behind stone walls? Because in medieval Europe, that happened constantly. Number 5. The trebuchet. Field battles get most of the attention, but much of medieval war in Europe was really about sieges. Castles, walled towns, fortified bridges, and strongholds shaped the whole map of power. That is why the trebuchet mattered so much. A great counterweight trebuchet was one of the most impressive machines of medieval warfare, and unlike earlier torsion engines, it used gravity and a falling weight to throw a projectile with massive force. In practical terms, that meant armies could smash at walls, towers, gates, roofs, and defended spaces from a distance with methodical, repeated power. The trebuchet was not quick to build and not easy to move, but once assembled and supplied, it could turn a siege into a brutal engineering contest. This weapon changed warfare because it attacked the main defensive fact of the Middle Ages: stone fortification. Castles were supposed to dominate the landscape and protect small elites from larger armies. The trebuchet did not make walls useless, but it proved that walls were not untouchable. Defenders had to repair damage, build stronger towers, deepen ditches, prepare countermeasures, launch sorties, and think constantly about how to survive sustained bombardment. Attackers, meanwhile, needed carpenters, engineers, laborers, rope, timber, quarrying, transport, food, and time. So the trebuchet showed very clearly that medieval warfare was not just about knights charging with banners flying. It was also about logistics, labor, planning, and the ability of a ruler to keep men and machines in the field long enough to break resistance. The psychological effect mattered too. Day after day of incoming stone could shatter morale even before a breach opened. In some sieges, Trebuchets hurled incendiaries or other special projectiles to spread fear and damage, showing how flexible the weapon could be. Medieval siege commanders also used bombardment together with mining, assault towers, blockades, and negotiation, which means the trebuchet sat at the center of a much bigger system of pressure. What really matters, though, is that the trebuchet pushed siege warfare toward a more technical, more organized form. Victory increasingly depended on engineering skill and sustained resources, not just personal bravery. And yet, even this huge machine belonged to the old mechanical world. The next great shift came when armies started replacing stored muscle and falling weight with explosive force. And that is where the hand cannon entered the story. Number 6. The hand cannon. Early gunpowder weapons were rough, noisy, smoky, and often unreliable. But that should not hide how important they were in late medieval Europe. The hand cannon was crude compared with later firearms. It was slow to load, awkward to aim, and sometimes as dangerous to the user as to the target if badly made. Even so, it introduced something medieval warfare had never seen in quite the same way before: portable, explosive force that did not depend on a bow stave, a crossbow prod, or the strength of the shooter's body. That changed the long-term direction of war. At first, hand cannons did not instantly replace older weapons. Longbows, crossbows, pikes, lances, and swords all remained important for a long time. But once gunpowder weapons appeared, armies started adjusting around them. Armor had to grow thicker and more expensive to stay useful.
Fortifications faced a threat that would only become worse as artillery improved. Rulers saw that firearms could be issued to troops who needed training, yes, but not the kind of lifelong physical development demanded by elite archery. That made large armies easier to imagine and, eventually, easier to standardize. Gunpowder also strengthened central authority. Cannons, powder, shot, and metalworking were expensive. States that could fund workshops, transport systems, and artillery trains gained an edge over nobles who depended mainly on traditional feudal methods. In other words, the hand cannon was not just another weapon on the battlefield. It was part of a wider shift in power. Late medieval armies began mixing firearms with pikes, wagons, artillery, and field fortifications in ways that pointed toward a different future. The Hussite Wars showed how dangerous disciplined troops with gunpowder weapons and strong defensive organization could be. Smoke, noise, and shock also had a battlefield effect of their own, especially against men and horses who had been trained for older forms of combat. By the 15th century, even a fully armored man had to face the fact that technology was moving against the old assumptions of knightly dominance. That does not mean the knight vanished overnight, because medieval warfare never changed that neatly. But the direction was clear. Once explosive weapons became part of European war, the battlefield stopped revolving only around the strongest rider, the best sword, or the tallest castle wall. Power was shifting toward drilled infantry, engineers, siege specialists, and rulers who could produce firepower in the field on a scale earlier centuries could not match reliably.